recording. I guess I shouldn't have started quite that quickly, but
okay.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, I can edit this first part out. So hi, this is Heidi Burgess, and I'm here for our third interview with Ron Wakabayashi. Got closer that time.
Yeah.
And we are talking about his work as a regional director at the Western region of the Community Relations Office. And the first two times that we talked about specific cases. And today I want to look more generally across the cases so that we're comparing trends that you've seen over the years. And the first question that I have is, if somebody was talking to you, if you were talking to a person starting out in CRS and they asked, what are the typical roadblocks or stumbling blocks that you run into frequently? And do you have any tricks for getting around them? Were there certain problems that came up very often?
I think there's several that come up. One is that, after you've been there for a while, that, and as your work and gets better known by community organizations and by, government and police, they know how to use you, and that's both good and bad. Sometimes it's helpful because they call you into a case early, which I think is generally helpful. Sometimes it's, they're trying to use you or use the department because you're affiliated with a branch of the federal government to create an impression of federal government support and potential intervention, in a different way than the way, that we as mediators and conciliators would operate. So sometimes they may kind of infer or try to create an atmosphere where we're not community relations service, but much more of a sense that we might be an enforcement arm.
Okay.
And I think you have to watch being exploited. Now, one of the things for me that was helpful is because I ran an advocacy organization. I mean, I understand their interest. Their interest is that they've got to represent their constituency and be perceived and act as an advocate. That's different than my interest that I want to be a neutral third party, impartial, wanting to help problem solve. And what was helpful, because I had that role before, I could explain to them, I understand your role and your interest, because I've been in that place. But this is different, for me. And it's like in disclosure, is interacting with the parties. I'm going to disclose that I'm an impartial neutral.
Right.
I mean, you could, I can't control what they're going to say. The other thing that I think comes up, for a new staffer is just being a governmental employee, particularly a federal one. Now, one level, feds have are really very good at having a regulation or a policy on anything you can imagine. But they're frequently conflicting, and depending on who is your leadership. Hold on one second. Depending on who your leadership is, they will kind of resort to or lean on different policies or regulations or practices that they're familiar with. So there's an inconsistency that comes up, and it's very difficult to resolve because there's so many conflicting policies, because they're really never, not never, but they're rarely kind of gone through and called out to see what is the current policy, so it's confusing. The other thing about federal service is that, just like any other political environment, is that you're vulnerable to kind of the political trends that take place, and the sensitivities and the perceptions that exist. So, for example, like in working within, like on a case in the community, on one day, you can be welcome and warmly received in the community. The day after inauguration, you're viewed as suspicious, which is a barrier. One other thing about being a Fed, I think, which is difficult, is that one of the things about CRS that has an advantage over most other federal agencies is that we're small. And in general, that gives us a greater agility. We can get to a critical incident much quicker than other agencies do, because by the time they vet an issue within their bureaucracy, the issue is pretty well established. We could and we should be out there, early. So we're agile in one sense. In another sense, your leadership is not so agile because they're tied into kind of, like the upline, when it's in the department, and whether interests, are being carried, like sort of government wide. And it tends to be cautious. It tends to be focused on metrics in order to kind of sell the agency and what they're doing. But the nature of what we do doesn't lend itself very well to metrics. And in fact, one of the problems I think that CRS incurs is we had a director that shifted the emphasis on our work plans, our personal work plans, to be services oriented. In other words, if I did 2 services, I got a credit toward my evaluation.
And what's a service considered to be?
A service could be, like a consultation. It could be a facilitated dialogue. It could be a mediation. It could be a whole variety of things. But they got focused on services. And what occurs is, like, not all services are the same. It's like, for example, like, what is a consultation? So if you gave a party a couple of documents that spoke to their issues and their concerns, sometimes that's a very helpful activity to kind of help, move the process along. Sometimes it's just giving a service so you get case credit. And so it created, I think, for a time, case credit, kind of dependency within conciliators, but also within the agency, because it gave you numbers to report upline and to the Congress. It became, part of the culture of the agency rather than measuring impact. And, and then the agency can become very, and depending on the administration, very, conservative, and not in the political sense, but conservative in the sense of not be very risk-taking. So, like, the current CRS has, for example, a list of approved programs and services that align to different situations, and you can do those. But the problem is, like, and only those. And you have to do them exactly as they're written, And so a thing like one of the things that CRS developed was a SPIRIT program. And the SPIRIT program is really a facilitated dialogue and a problems identification process. And it's an unusual process from the standpoint that we will do in the first phase, organize groups like in a school that are homogeneous. So, we would pull out a group of Black students, Latino students, Asian students, and process through them, what are the issues that those students have. And in theory, it's to extract, and it's giving sort of the comfort and security for people to identify issues. Okay, and that's round 1. Round 2 is heterogeneous groups. And then the problem solving happens in heterogeneous groups. So that's the design of it. Now, homogeneous groups, like out here in California, at a particular school, there are Latino students, but you would have people from the north and the south, Norteños and Sureños. There's as much different and conflict among those as any other groups. So it makes sense to separate those into two different groups. The process won't allow that.
And what happens if you do?
Then you get people at headquarters who have no experience in the field that says you can't do that. Because they're the same
Are they
group.
watching that closely?
Oh yeah, they review the cases, you know, and you know, like a Norteño and a Sureño, they're both Latinos by categories. And so it's not arguing that they're not, but it's arguing that that's not what the situation involves.
So you don't have any flexibility.
The current, and you know, it depends on your administration, but I think it's just vulnerable to kind of like I think government tends to want to stay safe. It tends to you know, like not want internal controversies. So you do only safe things. Doing services is pretty safe. You know, go out there and
Unless you do it the wrong way, I guess.
Yeah. So on one hand, I think CRS, like, and there was a period in CRS when you talked about to the old timers, when it was almost like wild frontier. You know, there was not what we would call standard operating procedures. And there's some problems with that, but there's also a lot of creativity and innovation.
Right.
So, yeah, the thing is, I think it needs a balance. I mean, you don't want people kind of, you know, like, you know, going outside the boundaries, you know, but at the same time, you don't want them just to kind of become robots.
Right.
And do mechanical things. So, I mean, it's like I think it's a different kind of situational awareness. It's know who you are as a Fed. And I think that's part of what the training should be.
Okay, good. One of the things I was wondering when you said that you're given credits for services, does that mean that you don't get credit for taking time to record what happened in a particular intervention or collaborate with colleagues to try to compare notes on who's doing what or what people have done in similar situations in the past, that kind of thing? Is that rewarded or not?
I think it's rewarded informally. It's rewarded from the standpoint of people who are practitioners, your colleagues. You know, I think colleagues recognize the value of all the things you said, of like debriefing a situation, studying a situation, and all that. But within the reporting structure, there, you know, there's no reward for that.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, like, if you want to be an employee that just kind of draws your paycheck, you know, you could be that and survive very easily. But if your interest is and is in the creativity and the application of the practice, you know, you've got to manage your way through this. You know, and actually I think overall in terms of government service, there are far worse places. I mean, there are far worse where it's so rigid. So you know, while I'm raising like what I think is a flaw in CRS, you know, it's a situation that you can work through. I mean, but it's a thing that you ought to be conscious of and manage.
Okay, that's good to know. Let me go on to a totally different question. We talked about this in passing in the earlier interviews, I think, but in the interviews that we did in our first round of this project, people talked a lot about the media and managing the media, not wanting the media in mediations because then they turned into more of a zoo than if they were private. And there were questions about when to bring them in and how to bring them in and why to bring them in. What's your experience with using or not using the media?
Well, you know, in that sense of using or the media using you.
I was thinking as I said that, yes.
That, you know, I mean, you know, I think it's the same thing that, you know, like as mediators, one of the things that we're kind of trained and conscious of are like, what are the interests of parties? And there's this, you know, like if we're talking about a dispute, we tend to look at parties as the people who are the disputants, but there are other parties and other interests that are there. And it's recognizing that like the arena that you're working in has all these other interests. And in a high profile case, the media, would like to kind of get the story and get in there. I generally, well, not generally, both by like sort of for CRS, we do not allow media in, our position. But it's perfectly permissible if the parties want the media in, that's their right.
So you let them override you.
Yeah, the media, but it's like, but we, but for ourselves, and even for ourselves, like we don't talk to media directly. That's not permitted. And so, I mean, there's been strange situations where I'm standing next to a reporter. He's on the phone with headquarters. I'm on the phone with headquarters. We're standing next to each other. I can hear him ask the question to headquarters. They're asking me the question. I'm answering. He can hear my answer, and then he can hear my answer repeated to him.
That's crazy.
It's crazy, but it's kind of like I can't. I mean, I understand the reason for it, but I think it's really tough to write those kind of rules. I mean, like I understand the principle of it. Because I know that there, like you can have an untrained or an undisciplined conciliator, wanting to jump in front of the media. I don't think that's a professional thing. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it works for our practice. But at the same time, when we think about media is one of the sources for us of information. I mean, for me, when I'm assessing a case, I keep my relationship with journalists.
How do you do that if you can't talk to them?
On a personal level, I can. I can't
Okay.
talk to them in terms of cases. But in general conversation, and we do, like there are all these journalist associations and things like that. Like I think during 9/11, the South Asian Journalists Association by far was the best source of rumor control, getting clear information taking place of all the media that I could find. So, I attached myself to, their website and monitor them, just all the time because they had, relevant information. But, and many of those people have kind of ascended into, the media world or in significant positions, now. But it's not like media is your enemy. I think with anybody, if you kind of have to cross train. This is my role and responsibility. This is my lane. I have to stay within this lane. If you just understand mine and I understand yours, we know where we can intersect and share. Like media frequently was a source of like a case. I would get reporters calling like, are you guys in this case? I said, I can't tell you that. But I think you called me to let me know. He says, well, that works too.
Yeah, right. So if say you're doing a mediation between community activists and a police chief or a school board, and the police chief or the school board says we want the media there, or the activists say that we want the media there, and then the media come, but start getting out of hand or somehow interrupting the proceedings, then can you ask for them to interact with them to get them to change what they're doing or leave or something?
Sure, I think that's just part of the ground rules.
Okay.
I mean, even in mediation, parties can agree that they want observers, that they want resource people, or they want, that's different than the parties themselves.
Right.
It's all part of the ground rules. If they want media there and they agree to it, they can. But even that, they have, like all those people still have different roles and ground rules. I mean, if you're sitting outside the table, your role is outside the table.
Right.
And I think the mediator's role is to help, in a sense, if you just carry out the neutral role, our role is to kind of ensure that, like a a process of communication between parties in dispute about what they're in their dispute about, working toward a resolution of it. That's your role. It's the resources around the table. And I think I talked about a case where I did call on some of the resources, with the permission of the parties. Like, what would you do if you were them? And they were people that offered the solution. But I think you're kind of a gatekeeper in keeping like a linear conversation to the extent you can. I mean, disputants not necessarily, but generally, have feelings about what their issue, and so it can become more emotional. So you're helping kind of manage through that.
Have you ever seen them when they have the media there that people are playing to the camera and overplaying their hand because they're trying to look good to the outside world?
Yeah, and that's really, like, generally, like, because that is that's, I think, just short of being a human tendency. I mean, not everybody does it, but many do.
Right.
And it's hard not to be, because even like if you think about, like, even yourself as if you think yourself as neutral, you still influence what's the conversation, even if you're not saying anything directly, and even if you are absolutely neutral, you could be perceived different ways. I mean, depending on, like, an identity facet, that you're male, or your age or class or whatever. The parties could be thinking, well, you think this, or whatever. You're still a factor in the room. We all influence it. So I think like, before you bring particularly someone like the media in, or even like, sometimes groups will want, like, a more aggressive advocate as a witness, because they know they'll act out afterwards.
Right.
And that's why I think you want agreement among parties, like, there are dynamics that are involved. But they'll play the cameras. They'll, like, it will have an influence, just think like it will, but that's your call.
And I presume if one side wants them and the other side doesn't, then that's just another thing to mediate.
Yeah, it's not, there's no agreement on that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question, we kind of covered the last time too, a little bit, was, were your goals short-term, just to get an agreement of the situation that was going on at the moment, or were they more long-term, trying to set up a process so that the parties would be able to work together more effectively in the future?
Well,
or both?
I think the bias in like, just the agency, community relations service, like, overwhelmingly, like, the nature of what we're responding to are critical incidents. So there's an immediacy there, just to, and in my own view, like, that I felt like if I can get people engaged, because frequently, we don't do the back end of the resolution process. If you can get to tabletop, we're frequently like there's a protest going on, like, and getting disagreements on the spot. And so I think that's the bias in our experience. I think if I was in an agency where we were doing much more tabletop, I might do it differently. But because our role was like, in situations that were typically like, there's upset involved and it's still fresh. You haven't had time to get even to engagement,
Right.
to agreement, like, like, do you think you could even sit down with these people? We're at the phase of, no, I can't sit down with them. The protest phase. I don't like them. I want to throw rocks and yell and scream. It's moving into the next period. So, there's a bias that I'm looking at like initial solutions. Like, so at anything I can grab on early on that smells of an agreement between the two parties, I will wrap it up, and put a bow on it and say, that sounds like that we agreed on this. Because I want to create, like, a reinforcement that, hey, we agreed, man, that was great.
Right.
And for people to understand start understand what agreement starts meaning. It's not all big stuff. Sometimes you build with little stuff, and the little stuff, feels okay, then it feels good, and then and it leads to the next step. So you kind of help move people into a problem solving mode.
So once they get into a problem solving mode, do you stick with them over the long term, or do you say, okay, my job's done, you guys do this yourselves?
I think it's just a tendency in all of us. I want to be there. You want to see it through to the end. I mean, like, I want to see the kid grow up.
Yeah.
But we can't. We're not always able to do it. I mean, I think one of the hardest things for us is to let go. Because and increasingly the world's different. Like when I first started, there were fewer conciliation resources, or even like people thinking in that kind of way, of that kind of role. There's much more now, and so I mean, we start
outside of CRS or in CRS?
Outside. Like my own background is I was the director of human relations commissions, both LA City and LA County. But in those roles, the training relative to conflict resolution is not as developed, because you've got a broader spectrum of activities that you're involved with. And so like I'll try to work with the commission and help build that capacity in them, and so that they can take it on and be the continuity. But it could be a community organization, it could be a church, it could be a civic organization, it could be a government entity. But I think I'd look for a home, for the issue to keep having like an ongoing processing, because the nature of that, we will get called to the next critical incident, and even if we continue with it, we won't be able to spend as much time.
Right. That brings me back to a question that I was thinking of earlier, when I don't quite remember what we were talking about, but I was wondering, when you said CRS is agile because it's small, that's what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. I was wondering how often as a regional director did you have to triage when you had 3 different things going on at once and not enough people to go to all 3? So which one are you going to go to? Or which one are you going to pull out of early because you have to go somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that's constant, and I don't want to overstate it. It's not every day that it feels like it's it's a decision that kind of is really weighty, but it does happen that you get critical incidents that have a confluence in terms of time or even space. And and I think there's other management issues that are involved with that, like who of the staff is best suited for something, or like I have a view that each one of us, every person on this planet, we work a case differently. We have different insights, different relationships and understandings. It just would operate a different sequence. And so you're sorting through that constantly. And then even personal kind of things like, hey man, my guy just is a new father. I'd like to keep him home. I'll go do that one.
Yeah.
Because the circumstances is like, my kid is growing up. I have greater flexibility. Now that's not true of all regional directors. But I would take what would be more difficult for my staff to do, either in terms of convenience or situations and whatever. So I like that, and it gives me an additional option if I'll do that. And like they changed that, where they said regional directors don't do any cases. So that got more difficult to do, but there's kind of degrees of that. Like even though like we were kind of instructed not to do cases, you could do a lot of kind of ground and legwork to help your conciliators. In other words, you become an assistant to them, to carry it on. So, I mean, I think it's constantly kind of managing, those kinds of factors, but it's also triage, and I think just generally for me, because I came into the organization like it, out of the experience in Los Angeles with civil unrest, where where that kind of violence, it was my top priority. In fact, my view of the agency, while this is not formally written, that our priority should be on stopping major violence. And I think we can do that even with a small staff, because we don't solve all of it. There's awful lot of other people that do, but we can do some facilitation to trigger early intervention in it. Because
do you think you're more effective stopping major violence in a preventive mode, so that you get into a problem where you can see things are getting tense, but it hasn't gotten violent yet? Or are you better off, are you effective once the violence has started, stopping it from escalating?
No, I mean, I'm more absolute on this one. Violence is not a good thing, period. And the I think the practicality of it is, the kind of events that you would characterize as like a major incident where violence could be involved is really a very small percentage, of what's on our plate. Most of it is like, you're running into kind of the situation where there's a flare up, and I even mean a police shooting. A police shooting is probably more on the major end, where you had a death involved and people are like a very emotional about what's taking place. That's toward the higher risk end of things. But even there, you can look at a continuum of situations. It could, it ranges everything from a traffic stop, to an officer involved shooting. And all along that continuum, like when one of us calls, and this is kind of a unique thing to being a Justice Department employee. If I call you up and you're a mayor or a police chief and say, "Hi, this is, my name is Ron Wakabayashi. I'm with the Department of Justice Community Relations Service, and I read or heard about this situation that happened, in your city, in your jurisdiction. Can you tell me about, what you know about that and what's going on with that?" And that's just a plain inquiry, right?
Right.
But when I hang up that phone, the behavior that happens is like, "Hey, Justice Department is interested in this, and we better take a look at this. We better get on it." So it's a catalyst role. In fact, if I was the director, I would require this. One of the things that we do is we're going to be like a radar system. We're going to scan for situations that develop, and minimally, we're going to call and ask, people who are involved that we can identify, just to give us an update on the situation. That just connects us. But
Right.
it also triggers their behavior, to take a look at it and see if they can fix something. So then there's two options. They may be able to hit it off early, or two, if it's beyond them, they can call us back and we could resource it, or we can help find a resource.
Yeah.
But that's not a whole lot of energy and and you can do it. You can cover a lot of territory doing that.
How do you keep your eye out? What are you watching to find out about incidents that you need to be aware of?
I think that's right now it's a portfolio of different things. So there are groups that have their own listservs, like the NACOL, the group that does citizens oversight. They have a listserv where their members kind of list, police incidents, and so it's a media thing, and most of it is not stuff you can read, but it's a quick, like 1 minute read, and you can read, "Oh, this one's something we could check out." You can do Google alerts, right? You can get that coming that way. You get other people who are at certain intersections of conflict. Certainly as you get to know, elected officials, and you get to know, law enforcement, they become a source. And even deeper, as you get to know communities, they're just folks and organizations that are on the ground, that are in touch, and they start calling you. I know, like with the sheriff's department, there's one woman that I know that's out at every incident, you know, and they've made her an honorary person, but she just goes in to give a hug, you know, but she's, she's someone at that intersection. When there is an incident, I mean, like, I think there's a lot of people. I mean, I said earlier, journalists are monitoring it. There was a guy in Seattle that, I don't know why he did this, but he had police scanners, and all this stuff. This is the way he lived. And he was kind of his own self-styled EMT.
Huh.
But he knew what was going on. I know a woman in Phoenix, she's got all these police scanners and is monitoring incidents. And she was involved with immigration work, and looking out for the welfare of immigrants. But she's a great source. I mean, so a lot of bloggers, I mean, actually, I talked to an IT guy and I asked him, like, do you think you could, create an algorithm, that can monitor internet to identify, like most of these situations developing, like when you're getting clusters of different kinds of things on social media or whatever. And he said, yes, but government will never have it because there'll be too many barriers to it. I think that's true. And it may even be the right thing that government doesn't get it. But, it just says that there are ways for yourself to construct, a warning system.
Yeah, it just sounds to me like you could put somebody on this full time and
you can't, it's a great use of student interns.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And it's a great learning for them. And actually their proficiency, like in terms of like technology, is usually much better than us older folks.
Right.
And they'll know the difference. I mean, like within CRS, like if we talk to the current conciliators in management about what's the difference between passive and active involvement in social media, and you'll get a blank stare. And passive, use is perfectly okay. You just go on and drop a search word into Twitter or Facebook and see what's going on, right?
Right.
Active is
call it lurking.
Yeah, active is different. That's not permissible.
Right.
For us to do. So we can't do that. For some things, for like especially like extremist groups, someone would have to do active, because usually you have to be invited in. You have to do more than lurk. You have to lurk and do enough to get invited in, and then you can get into different spaces.
Yeah, and I would imagine you're not allowed to do that, are you?
Not to do it, but you're allowed to know people who do it.
Okay. Yeah. So this question may be a repeat of what we've already talked about, or you may have something more. How do you measure success?
That's really a hard question.
Or I guess another way to ask it is, do you worry about it?
I think my standards are pretty low, and yet they're very practical. I mean, I think that if I can get parties engaged, if there's a dispute, but I can get them at least to agree that they'll talk, the odds are then that they're not going to beat each other up or do something else. And like I would view that as success.
Okay.
I don't think there is any kind of final resolution. I mean, like the nature of life is like we're in, like a giant ocean of people stuff, and there's different currents that you can't see, that are just swishing things all around, and that's just a constant thing. And so I don't think there's a final thing where you can fix all of that, and that's pretty grandiose thinking anyway, that you could fix it. But like if we know that there are always these kind of cross currents that are operating like in the kind of environment that we're in, and we just take the time to say, like, let's keep an eye on those, and when some of those becomes larger, like We had that Tongan volcano eruption.
Right.
That's a once in a century event, right? But it does happen. But we've learned a lot about like how you deal with once in a century events. I mean, we can forecast it coming, right? And with the smaller events, I think we can do things to just kind of even get to what I've said, like engagement. If the parties are talking, I don't think our work is brain surgery, because if it was, I couldn't do it. And just not bright enough. But I think if you just kind of just pay attention and listen to folks, you hear stuff. Like this anti-Asian violence that cropped up. We were way ahead of becoming national news. I mean like my staff. You can see the things happening in the dynamics. I mean, you had this growth in homelessness. The growth in homelessness like put like a lot of like dynamics in place in certain kind of neighborhoods where there were concentrations. And in fact, right near Lunar New Year. Lunar New Year has always been a time where street crime in Chinatown increases. Because during Lunar New Year, the old timers are carrying, they're giving monetary gifts to their grandchildren, to friends. The red envelopes. That's customary, but like the people who live around them like learn that. But it also becomes a source of victimization and crime. So it's not necessarily hate crime, but it's a rise in crime that's going to happen during Lunar New Year, which is, in my view, it's more a crime of opportunity. But it's going to raise the anxiety of people in Chinatown. And in this country, so many things that go on kind of get framed in a racial, definition. And sometimes that's useful to understand the problem that's going on. And sometimes it's not, it conceals it. I think, like the economic disparity is a bigger issue in this mental health issue. When you look at kind of the egregious stuff going on with communities, I mean, people that push people off platforms into subways, that's generally, I mean, and, like a random act, that's a psychological problem. I mean, there's racial elements in it, and I understand the anxiety, but that our mental health system doesn't treat those folks. I mean, just the degree of homelessness, would explain a whole lot.
Are the homeless a constituent group that CRS focuses on, or do you stay in the realm of race, gender relations?
Well, like our legacy statute is race, color, national origin.
Right.
And even Shepherd and hate crime, homelessness, I mean, was specifically brought up, as a category. It's not a protected class.
Right.
So it's not. But if you look at who are the homeless and how they profile, it is.
Okay.
So, and there are things. I mean, when you look at like, before the, like if you looked at homelessness, 10 years ago, there was just this irrational violence. People would just go in and beat up a homeless person just because they're vulnerable. It may not hit the statutory requirement, but it's hate. And, when you look at the percentage of the homeless that are Black, that's, there's a disparity that dynamic is. So it's tricky. It's kind of like the stuff that for the agency you can get beat up on, that you're outside your jurisdiction. So it's one that's not slam dunk in your jurisdiction. But I think for us working in the field, that it's associated.
Right.
So it's tough. I know that Brian Levin, who runs the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, he's clearly an advocate that homelessness should be a category, protected category. because it happens so frequently. And I shared that with him, but but I don't think that it technically is.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, but maybe not. How do you see the change in the civil rights movement and race relations over the period starting when you first started at CRS going up to now? What I've observed recently is what appears to me to be a whole lot less willingness to negotiate or to collaborate with authorities on the part of both progressives and perhaps even less so, I'm not sure, the racial minorities. There seems to be more of a push for justice as opposed to compromise. Does this affect the way CRS operates? Do you see that? Do you not see that?
No, I think there's this like I think that's a complicated question. That when we talk about like sort of the extremes, like the alt-right and like represented by Proud Boys and groups like that, or what's called Antifa, which we called anarchists before, but both of those, like by their ideology, will not deal with government. And so that's a difficult realm to operate in, because if you're government, they don't want to deal with you, period. And that manifestation is like larger and more pronounced than it was before. So I think that's significant. I think it's not the whole environment, like I think there still is, a population of folks that are generally just interested in like at a real rudimentary level, like, hey, we just want to see what's right, what's fair, and those words get really complicated when you get academics and you get lawyers into it, because those can be really complex, concepts,
right,
of what's right. But just among regular folks, I mean, like just at a gut level, saying, we just want what's right. We just want, and that's most of the everyday domain that you're operating in. And I think you can solve things, at that level, or you can get things to engagement at that level, because the people are just interested in like, let's just make it right, make it fair, and it's not like real hard corners on the definitions. It's just like, does this feel okay to you? It may not be everything, but does it feel okay to you? At that level of human problem solving, if we can get, like kind of just taking advantage that it's there, I think there are just the harder corners that are there, and I think that's politically very challenging for everybody, and it's stuff that we all have to know, like especially those who are in the work. We've got to learn to navigate. Like I know, I was talking to people about like even doing what's called town halls and things like that, where you have public testimony. I mean, what I recommend to people is changing that format a little bit. Like if we're going to do a public comment, and it's about a controversy and it's emotional, I think I would set up a thing of like, we're going to do that on stage. We'll have the audience so people can witness it, and that's a fishbowl. But if you want to testify, sure, you sign up and do the other stuff, but we'll escort you upstairs on the stage, and the listeners will be on stage too. We'll have you in easy chairs. We'll still have time limits. But one of the things, just by doing that, son, like if you're on the audience floor with like your constituency, you're going to be a cheerleader. You're going to be playing to the audience. If we have you on stage just talking to folks, like and they do it reasonably, like so. The purpose of this is that people are hurting, and like we'd like to understand that. And we really want to listen to it. And here's the deal. We're up here away from everyone else, just us, and we're going to listen. They can listen to us too, but we want to understand what the thing is. Now, if we got so many people, so we may run out of time. But if we run out of time, there's another group of folks, and they're you'll go off stage with them, and they'll continue and capture all of it. For people who are not comfortable doing it this way, here's an email address, here's a text message, there's some newsprint out there, there's some pads and paper, different ways you can get it to us. But I think it's like kind of expanding the listening. You know, like if you want to listen and you want to hear, you design it for that. And I think that, you know, like, you know, I've used that format. It works. You know, if you said like, I want to listen, or even like I think we talked earlier just about the reframing thing. Tell me, I want to listen to it, and I'm going to say it back to you, so I make sure I got it right.
Right.
So it's just an active listening thing, and it just changes dynamics. I mean, I've done this with police, and afterwards they come back and says, you know, like he says, you know, not in a hot situation where the guy has a gun, but you know, when you're just talking to like a domestic call, and they're all excited, it works. It calms them down. You know, they get focused on wanting to tell their story and tell you in a way that, because you're going to repeat it back. They want, you know, they don't want to leave something out or unclear or say it in a kind of way that's misleading, because they're going to get it fed back to them. I mean,
Right.
it's all structured, and it's like, you know, like it works.
Do you train the officials, the police or the school superintendent or whoever you're going to have in that town hall up on stage? Do you train them to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wouldn't even call it training. It's more explaining, because that's not you know, it's just explaining sort of conceptually what you're trying to do. You really want to listen, and when you if you want to listen, you know what that does is it helps them focus on telling you their truth.
Right.
You know, and you could do more than one round on it. You know, you can go back and forth on it. Like,
Right.
you know, got it wrong. Well, help me again. What did I get wrong? You know, but that just engages further.
And can you help the the regular people, the advocates in doing that too? Or is that a harder audience to get involved with that?
You know, I think it's the same kind of thing. If you think about the dynamics that when I said I was the director of an advocacy organization, okay, so you see that as your role, your mission, your identity. You need to be an advocate. I think that, like, and it's to be respected. We want you to be an advocate, and one is, I think, to let people know, I understand that that's your role. I understand that that's your role, and this is my role. But there's a window and there's an opportunity that we can, you know, you know, this is a time that we're together, and we can make one little inroad maybe, you know, and whether we see is that time or not, you know, and that's a choice, you know, and I think it's helping them out to get outside their role. Like if I'm an advocate in my constituency, you know, if I can help them reinterpret their role, is that, you know, like it's sort of interest and position.
Right.
You know, what is your interest in advocating that? You know, because the advocacy is the position.
Right.
You know, and it's really, it's remarkable to me that, like, for us in the profession, that mediators, we have this stuff, right? And we can give it to, I mean, that's kind of like, that's like 101 in mediation training, right?
Right.
But it's so critical. I mean, it's really the whole nexus of it.
Right.
And it's not brain surgery, you know? So that's why I say, I don't think it's even training. It's like helping people look at it. So like, even if we're doing things like we talk about, like facilitated conversation, you know, facilitated dialogues and stuff. Like, I'm working right now on a hate crime training, in a sense. So we have, you know, like a tabletop simulation. So the first slide kind of creates a situation where, okay, this looks like a hate crime, has like all the ingredients of it. But but the audiences, I want to have the U.S. attorney, the district attorney, city attorneys, law enforcement, or representatives of those offices, community folks and all that. And then you go through that like, okay, we have this incident take place. Looks and smells like a hate crime, just the circumstantial stuff. What are you guys doing at this point? You go through them and you facilitate the cross training, and because with the prosecutors, they have a legal need to say that's got to meet a certain standard. For the community folks, this is no, I'm terrified. I'm terrified for my kids and my parents. You can help draw out the different interests. But then you could do what we just said about like a listening thing with them. Can we do a little exercise? Like you explain how you're feeling and you feed it back to them. And then you do the same thing about your role as like law enforcement, because the prosecutor's saying like, if I'm going to go after, this guy, I want to get the evidence. I need to have that to get to the court. I need it to stick. Community doesn't understand that.
Right.
But if you can get them to understand that they really have kind of common interest when you do that exchange, what you end up with is like, I want to help you, rather than, because if you don't, they get in each other's way.
Right.
So, yeah, I think, yeah, it's not brain surgery, but it's trainable and you can build it into a lot of different situations.
Great. So sort of a related question to where we started, we went off in a different direction. Does the political polarization of the country affect what CRS is doing?
Yeah, it does, because I think we've got to, like the high profile stuff, are the extremes. And there's an additional step that you've got to do. Like either if you're dealing, you can't really deal with the extremes very well because ideologically they won't engage. So how do you impact their influence on the dynamics of it? And you can't cut that out completely, but you can help folks saying, like get to the point of like, but for you, not I understand lots of other stuff, but what is it that you want out of this? And just kind of help focus it. I think it requires us to manage a case differently. We have to be conscious that of the presence of that dynamic, but that dynamic, at least so far as I've seen, does not sustain. They quit because you can only take that so far, and just from a community organizing standpoint, unless you can have some success, it dissipates. And that's been true both on the left and the right. It works very much in the short term. You could say stuff like defund the police, and it grabs the media because it sounds radical. But when you sit down and talk to them, that's it's not what they mean. I mean, like,
Right.
It gets back into what is your interest?
Right.
What about grandma down the street, man? She's just been like, she's been purse snatched, and her house was broken into. So what do we want to do for grandma? What's our interest? You dare say none, that we don't care about her? We care about her, but it's kind of the unintended consequence, like, of what people see as law enforcement. But if you can get that into I don't think there's like kind of a concrete fix, like if law enforcement was organized this way, it would work perfect. It's ongoing change, like even like things like civilian review. The data is that peer review by law enforcement, gives stricter punishments for law enforcement than citizen review. And you can show them the data. And then because they'll say, well, we want citizen review because, they're just policing themselves. I said, well, there's stuff to that. One is they understand what the standards are better. That may not be the answer either, because there's also kind of the blue line stuff. That dynamic is there. It's all that it's you can look, it's complicated. And there's not like a single solution to it. Even if you did like appointments from the community or election by the community, go check out, like the history on those and who wins those elections. It's not people, from the neighborhood that get elected. It's people from other neighborhoods that get elected.
Huh.
you know, and what does that do for you, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think you have to study it like to help shed light on things, but it gets back into like, it's really like it's, I think mediation has such a genius, like the difference between interest and position is, when someone points it out to you, it's like, oh yeah, right. It's, that's really an important distinction, and one gives a pathway and the other doesn't. Yeah, and you get these aha moments, but you can see other people get them as you go through it. So
What do you do though with the extremists? When I was doing consensus building collaboration myself, we always tried to make sure that we had all the relevant parties at the table, because there was the theory that if you didn't have somebody at the table, then they act as a spoiler afterwards and try to undo the agreement. So if you don't have Antifa and Proud Boys at the table and come up with an agreement that they don't like, and then they try to undercut it, how do you avoid that?
I think at the front end, like it's like that, like the ideologies of the two groups on both extremes, are not toward any kind of conciliation.
Right.
It's like the thing is like, I want you dead and you want me dead. There's only one solution to that. One of us has to die. Well, go do that over there. Because over here we're going to do, and one of the conditions of the conversation here is that we don't want anyone to die. And if you can't meet that, like, you're in a whole different realm.
So just push them aside and let them do their thing.
Well, no, it's their choice. Like the conditions that come in, I mean, I agree with the basic concept of we want to be inclusive. If you want to be inclusive, yeah, it's open to everyone. But to be open to everyone is to say, like, we don't want anyone to die. Everybody's in. Everyone's got equal stand. If that's not the deal, that's a different universe that you want to play in. So if you don't, those are the rules of this sandbox. If you want, playing this sandbox, that's there. I don't feel the need to be inclusive of everything. I mean, there's crazy people. I don't want to include them. I mean, I want them taken care of, but like, it's like if someone's dangerous or just kind of like really counterproductive because they can't be linear. I mean, the capacity's not there. I mean, what does inclusive mean? I mean, there's got to be some threshold of being able to participate, and either by your ideology or your capacity, if you can't participate, it's, I don't know if it's so much exclusion, but it's inclusion. There's, to be in the sandbox, this is what you have to agree to.
And did you have problems of people who weren't in the sandbox trying to undercut the agreements that were made, or was that not an issue?
Sure, that's the case, because like their interest is not for those kind of resolutions. Like they
right.
They'll try to undermine it, and they'll try to make you look bad or whatever else. But it's not, like, I think the important thing for us in our work is like, that's not my position. I'm a neutral in this thing. In fact, that's one of the safest things about, like, it's kind of being chicken. I don't have a position. I don't have a position. People have a position in terms of my role. If I had a position, I can't play this role.
Right.
And actually, there's a great deal of potential safety in that. Because you get more at risk in a target if you have a position. And saying, I can't have a position in this role. I can't. That the whole idea of this is that you need someone to, that will not take a position, to make this work. And so you give that up to do this.
Makes sense.
No, but, so I think there's a difference between exclusion and inclusion.
Right. Okay. Similar historical questions. Have you seen changes in policing and the types of issues that arise with police over the time you were at CRS going all the way up to now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when we first started, the idea of community policing was a fringe issue, is touchy feely, and you just, now everyone speaks to it. I mean, even the most authoritarian departments talk about, we do community policing. They may not understand all of it, and clearly, in some ways, clearly they don't. But you don't hear many voices that are contrary that says, no, we're against community policing. Therefore, they just redefine it differently, or they have a different concept of it. So that world has changed quite a bit. I mean, the discussion is, becomes things of like, yeah, like, how do you address implicit bias? Before, if you asked like law enforcement, okay, what do you think about implicit bias? You would go like, I don't know what you're talking about. Implicit, what is that? Now I think you get a much higher percentage of people saying, okay, I understand what they're talking about, what they mean by it. I don't get it all, but I know what they mean by that. I could see some of it. It's moved quite a bit. And like I was just talking to some folks about doing some work with some police. And you can, like, if you do their own self-assessment, like, and you couldn't get away with this before, but if I got two, this is old school, this is analog, two newsprint pads, and one you titled law enforcement, and the other you titled peace officer, because they're both right.
Yeah.
And you said, okay, like, first let's go on this one. And so, like, during your typical day, let's write down all the things that you do, typical day, that are law enforcement, and typical things that are peace officer. Okay, and I'll go write them down. By the end of the exercise,
So I'm thinking that they're the same. So what would go on the peace officer list that wouldn't be on the law enforcement list?
their daily activities that they're doing, stops for domestic violence.
So peace officer is more preventive and law enforcement is more reactive?
Well, you can define it that way, or it's like one is more like keeping the peace. How do we keep calm? And the other is, how do we enforce things? We have to law enforcement is like to stop bad guys.
Okay.
Officers is helping us. Can we all get along?
Okay.
And so during the day, like during a typical day for law enforcement, a patrol officer, he's doing overwhelmingly peacekeeping. So then you take, okay, like, we'll tear that off and let's stick those up on the wall. Is, during a typical day, you may do a thing, on law enforcement, but that's rare. I mean, you have officers who go their whole career who never pull their guns, but they do all this other stuff. So now let's take those same headings. The training that you receive, let's list all the things on those sites. It's overwhelmingly law enforcement.
Right.
Okay. So what message do you get about what you're supposed to do and be if that's all you're training? And if you're not trained to do this other stuff, how well do you do that? Because, the stuff on domestic violence, stuff about listening skills, all that stuff works there.
Right.
And so, like, you can kind of use this as kind of an exercise, extracting kind of the information from them. Let's say, like, it sounds like this stuff over here is more community policing stuff that we've talked about, right? And they move. So the stuff is all there.
Is the police training today still the same as at all law enforcement and not keeping the peace, or is it getting better?
It's getting better, but it tends to be like they'll do things like we need to have an understanding about cultural diversity, but cultural diversity is a tricky thing. I mean, it tends to be tacos on Tuesday, that, like, what people can understand culturally are more objective culture. This is what people wear. This is what their holidays are. This is what they eat, and I think, like, diversity training should be more, what are people's buttons? You know, and how did they get there?
Yeah,
You know, you know, I think you could do that. Or I like even when I was the human relations director, I wouldn't do diversity training because of the tacos and Tuesday view I have of it. I focused on like identity management, that, you know, all of us are the one constant in every transaction that we have. And we have multiple identity facets, and only a certain ones are dominant in a transaction most of the time. Like your interaction with your husband has so many facets that someone said, "What's he like?" You know, it'll take you, you know, a book to write that, what he's like.
right.
Very complicated human being, right? But if someone you're just encountering, it's like, well, you know, Heidi is like, you know, a woman, you know, she's about this age group, you know, she's white, you know, you do all those kind, and like, so like if you had like, if you, this is another analog metaphor. If in your file cabinet you pull out your manila folder on white women, and you only have 3 pieces of paper in it, you almost have to go to stereotype.
Right.
If you go to your own folder about white women, since you are one, you probably have a drawer full, and this is like, okay, what are white women like? Well, okay, I need to write another book. It's harder to stereotype,
Right.
you know. But it's you know, you can use that metaphor to say, like, you know, like that's what implicit bias involves. You know, that we have, you know, like this analog metaphor of a file cabinet. So, you know, I think that policing is different in that, you know, like the training hasn't done a lot of that, but I think it's possible to do, and it's gotten better. I mean, I think they've gone beyond tacos on Tuesday, but I think it's tough to fit when you think about law enforcement. Like when there's one department that we're working with right now. You know, the amount of time it takes to flip a culture, you know, to get in training time, because in spite of everything, you know, their time is pretty stacked up, because, you know, school teachers and law enforcement, we load everything on them,
Yeah.
you know, because it's convenient,
Right.
you know, and in many ways it's not fair. And with law enforcement, they do have that aspect of like, you know, that, I mean, it's drilled into them, like at the end of the day, you know, be safe out there. At the end of the day, you want to come home.
Right.
Well, that'll make me a little nervous if I hear that every day,
For
you know.
sure.
So, but I think it's made improvements, but I think, you know, as we get older, you start learning like these things take a long time to happen.
Yeah.
You know, because you can write it up pretty fast.
Right. Let
But
me ask the same question about education. Do you think the schools have changed over the period that between when you started and now?
they must have, you know, because when I went to school, like there was still corporal punishment.
I
You
don't
know,
think I had that.
you know those triangular rulers.
Yeah.
I remember getting
Wow.
whacked.
Wow.
You know, I getting whacked. They can't do that now. They get sued,
Right.
right? They get arrested. It's a moving target. Like even culturally, like there's a practice of, you know, like when you're bad. Like when I hit my kid sister, my dad burned me with incense,
Whoa.
and I could see the thing glowing. I still got the scar,
Whoa.
and we would call that child abuse today.
Right.
You know, I don't consider it child abuse. It hurt like heck.
And you didn't hit her again, huh?
But yeah, but the context, I understood the context of it right now, and saying, okay, you know, like for him, that was not child abuse. That was just standard. You know, it'd be child abuse. So there's a lot of stuff that's situational that changes, and so it's hard to compare the different eras, you know, in schools, in education. I mean, there's things now, like even what we're doing now on Zoom, this is just so remarkable to me that we could
Right,
do, you know? Yeah, during the pandemic, I couldn't see most of the extended family. We can Zoom,
right.
I mean, we're gonna have it next week, because then like there's babies, my oldest sister, Pat, she's passed, and I mean, there's just so much that happens even in a year
Yeah.
we, but I can gather the whole clan.
Yeah,
It's
Zoom's wonderful, although I gather it doesn't work too well for kindergartners. I
oh,
have a kindergartner granddaughter who tried Zoom kindergarten. That really was not terribly effective.
what's funny to me is when I see like little like pre-toddlers that they'll walk up to any screen and touch it.
Yeah, and they'll try to, when you're doing a Zoom with your granddaughter, she'll try to feed you, which I
Yeah.
think is great because it shows they think you're there. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
way better than not reacting to it, but it is interesting.
But I think it's scary now. Like global warming scares the heck out of me. I mean, I think I'm fortunate, like I probably won't have to suffer the worst of it. But I mean, that's gonna overwhelm everything.
Yeah,
See it already.
yeah. Again, going to historical considerations, do you see administrative changes either within CRS, we've talked about that some, also within the federal government overall? Certainly there's changes from Republican to Democrat and back and forth, but do you see any trends long-term in terms of their attitude towards CRS or the kinds of work that CRS does?
I think of late, well, there's been an elevation of interest in conflict resolution and in the work we do. I still think there's this, and there's an increasing understanding of what's involved. Because it's interesting, like before, like if there was any kind of like racial conflict, like you're gonna read this paper in the newspaper eventually if it was big enough that they sent this out. And like if you're inside, you're going like, well, it's too late to send this out. There's really very little you can do when everything's burning.
Right.
I mean, like, if you can send me out, give me a hose. So the understanding is improved, like they know that they need to do it earlier. But and there are more practitioners, not just in CRS, but like around, who can interpret it. Like the head of the Civil Rights Division in California's Attorney General's office has got his master's in conflict resolution.
Oh,
So you find more characters like this around who get it much more. And
okay.
I think that audience is expanded, because I think that the previous understanding was like, you run into a crowd and hold your arms out and say, everyone stop. I don't know how you stop a riot. It's hard enough to figure out how one starts.
Right.
But stopping is even harder. How do you tone it down? So, but I think there's kind of a growing understanding of like there is a methodology, there's a way, and people can, that you can study it rather than random things of stop or and not thinking it through. I think that has advanced even in like in all circles, but not universally. But that's true of all things. I mean, you could, like I know when I listen to the conversations about vaccines, I can't. It blows me away to listen to what some elected officials say about COVID. It's I mean, folks, it's just I can't, you know, I've accepted science, right? So, but, you know,
That's one CRS can't get involved in, probably just as well.
yeah, uh, you know, but I think, you know, like, even like when you get the things about like, you know how they poll everything numbers, like the anti-vaxxers versus, you know, like you see the percentages, but the percentages on almost anything, like we've seen a whole lot more percentages of public attitude. And those numbers have surprised me. Like if you said like 40% of people like, you know, were mistrustful of it, that would have surprised me.
Yeah,
You know, and like, so now that I'm seeing this 40% number in so many places, you know, it's like saying, wow, you know, like people are more divided, you know, at a real fundamental level than I thought. You know, I thought that number was more like 20%. It's double. And so conflict resolution seems like even harder
yeah,
when it's, and so like it modifies goals. I mean, like it's of like what's peacekeeping if you have that level of difference that seems like it's almost structural the way we're built. You know, I think for me personally, it kind of takes me toward like, no, there's more things I want to avoid than I did before. Before I would engage it because I think you could, you know, this change was possible. Now I think in some ways I'm more pessimistic thing.
I just find it phenomenal that a disease could be made political. I mean, I can't think of anything that is less political than a disease. A virus is going to infect a person regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat. The fact that that became political is just phenomenal to me. But it also strikes me as a tenor of our time that absolutely everything is political.
Yeah, and it's, you know, and you know, and there's things that like, well, I mean, like right now, Ukraine worries the heck out of me. You know, like I'm really gonna watch the Winter Olympics, you know, because it's in China, and watch this, you know, we're gonna boycott that, you know, and it's China has had a very severe close down policy,
Right.
you know. You know, I don't know how to prevent this. You know, it's really kind of what is it going to trigger, you know, out of that. So I don't know. It's in some ways, you know, like I think it's I've retreated some, saying, you know, I don't think as much of like sort of the conflict in the world is fixable, you know, and so before I think my attitude was more like I want to engage it so we can help fix more of it. And now it's probably more selective and saying like, no, I want to pick the ones I think we can fix that, you know, like have the most relevance to like kind of the place and time I have left. You know, so the police department I said I'm working with, you know, that's the one in my community, and it just happens that, you know, there's a window. So yeah, I want to do that one, even though I'm retired.
Yeah.
You know, and with DCP, the reparations thing is just personally, you know, like interesting to me, just because I was the director of the JCL when we did the Japanese American redress, and you can see the parallels in the process, and I feel fortunate in having had a prequel, you know, and I think we, you know, our meeting this morning was really that, like California is becoming very close to like producing a report that will run about 1,000 pages on the
Wow.
legacy. And you know, even the current report was only 40 pages on the legacy. And this one goes probably in the most depth in linking it, and I think is going to be a very powerful document once it's released in public conversation, even though it's 1,000 pages. Because 1,000 pages, when you think about all of what's involved, is really very concise.
So what's it documenting?
The legacy of slavery.
Okay, in California or nationwide?
It has to be nationwide in a sense, but it's California. It's got clearly a California bent because it's a California commission. And California is not a little, but it's different because we weren't a slave state. And so the concept of reparations and all, I mean, it's a little convoluted. You have to get there, but the report itself, the content of the report, I think is going to be really useful because it's convenient. Even though it's 1,000 pages, it's in one spot.
Right.
You know, and they've done a good job with it. And you know, and it's just sort of discussion. I mean, like part of what we're doing with it ties to like prior experience, but you know, the people that followed reparations, you know, like it's really a narrow audience of people who followed it from the time Conyers introduced a reparations commission bill that he introduced right after we had a successful passage of our bill. But it's not moved since. But you know, Biden said he supports it. So and it's going to come to at least a floor vote and pass the House. It won't pass the Senate, but it'll have more profile than it's ever had. And it's had a Ta-Nehisi Coates and some literature on it has elevated its profile. But the core people following it are really a narrow group of what, and they use the language American descendants of chattel slavery. You know, and they're using that as that should be the beneficiary definition, not Caribbeans who came later and not all this, but that has all kinds of other implications in terms of conflict, because you know, you have all the Caribbeans that came later, and the chronology is like Jim Crow and all that comes after slavery, you know, and how do you deal with that? And in sort of the courts, you know, courts have not favored, you know, race-based remedies, you know, as well as problem-based, you know, remedies. So there's all these things that are going to play out. So it's in the period where, you know, all the factors for all this agitation is there, but it's out there. There's nothing, you know, like any of us could do to stop it. We can help make it some ways better for people to understand the dynamics. And California's got a public engagement process with this. They dropped $800,000 into buying, you know, the format for this process. They've hired communication managers, you know, and there'll be a real process to do public engagement. But that, you know, and the report coming out, I think will elevate the conversation and expand it, which will bring in a different audience, not just the more narrow descendants, but a broader audience, and that'll change the discussion.
It will also create a lot more conflict, will it not?
I think so, but it's kind of like, I mean, as part of our job, I think is to look ahead and say, you know, what are the dynamics in place and what are the conflicts that come out of that? I think our conflict with China is going to keep the Asian hate crime stuff high. You know, there'll be, and there's other incidental stuff, like this is Lunar New Year, and Lunar New Year has more crime in general because they know that people are carrying cash for the, you know, lycee, the red envelopes and those things, and it goes up every year in Chinatown during this time period. But this year it's going to be equated with hate crime, and a lot of that is going to be African American perpetrators, and it's going to drive rifts there.
So is this something that CRS is likely to get involved in?
Unfortunately, the current CRS does not have the apparatus to kind of look downfield.
Okay.
You know, I mean, and they should be looking at.
Is that because they're too small?
No, it's because the leadership does not come out of field experience.
Okay.
You know, I think people in the field can look at this. I mean, you look at like with the stuff going on with China, you know that there's going to be more cases at universities with professors being sanctioned for being spies. You know, they just happened. You know, it happened before. It's going to happen again. You know, there'll be controversies around the Olympics. I mean, something will go on with some of the competition between that and the athletes. COVID is going to kind of help keep a separation of athletes from the public. But under other times, you know, that interaction will have some controversy, you know, in both directions. You know, the Chinese folks are really very anti-American because that's what they learn, you know, and they'll tick us off. And then, you know, there's just, I think it's just playing, you know, like it's looking, I mean, I think part of the role for CRS is that we should be looking for those things. You know, where is it going to pop up? And
Right.
to preposition, you know, like FEMA prepositions water, we need to preposition relationships so that it pops there. You know, you have someone's phone number. Hey, I just read.
Yeah.
You know, you need us, we'll be there. You know,
what % of your cases do you initiate like that versus, well, you're not at CRS, but when you were at CRS, what % do you initiate compared to somebody calling you and saying, hey, we need your help?
I think about half of it we initiated. We would watch for things, you know, some of it, you know, cases are situated like police shootings. You can look at some departments like, you know, you guys have had 6 in a row, you know, the next one's likely to go off. You know, you can preposition some of that. But some departments, you know, it's just like you catch a, you know, like a bad incident, just, you know, like, you know, and I can give examples of that, but like there's stuff where, you know, you say that couldn't possibly have happened, but it did, you know, and so it looks really bad. And it's just going to take time to kind of process through, but you kind of know where that will end up because the information will kind of even it out, saying like it's just kind of a really bad situation. I mean, there's always kind of the foundation that there's always, you know, like a foundation of folks who are very suspicious of law enforcement, period. That's going to be there. But, you know, like Ferguson was a situation where it's a town of 20,000 people. You had 35,000 warrants issued the year before Michael Brown was killed. 25% of the city revenue comes from that.
Whoa.
Those same proportions were for the 21 cities are in the St. Louis metroplex. You know, that's a structural situation, but you could see it develop, right? Like you know, like if you did any town, like if you have 20,000 people and you stop that many to issue 35,000 warrants, then police community relations are probably going to be tense. And then if they learn that it's a main, you know, revenue stream for the city, not just for that town, but for all the surrounding towns, you know, then, you know, it's got a lot of legs on it, right? But it's hard to see all that stuff, you know, beforehand. You know,
I guess those are astounding numbers, though.
Yeah, but when you get into it, but you could spot some of that kind of stuff beforehand, sometimes, and just know that situations like that exist. Like I know in California, we looked at like cities that disrupted, and we have 2 kinds of cities in California: what they call charter cities, you know, and like public law cities. So in the state constitution, you can form a city, and there's a template for how the city is set up. You know, council districts and all that stuff. So you have a general law city, and then you have, charter cities. When you look at the cities that had major disruptions, they were all general law cities. The general law cities all called for at-large elections. So you had very little minority representation in that structure. The charter law cities had district elections. So you had,
interesting.
and then you could sort it out and going, but we backed into that one. We just saw these cities disrupting. And this happened to kind of like look at the charter general offices, and because we knew the council setups, and said like that's part of the problem.
It's
But
fascinating.
then you can back up and say, hey, this was structural, right?
So it sounds like if people feel like they have a voice, they're less likely to riot or to be disruptive than if they don't feel like they have a voice.
Yeah. So engagement is critical. You know?
And they must think that having a representative is adequate engagement, adequate representation, which is interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, just generally, like there's going to be conflict. I view conflict as natural. In fact, it's useful, right? To help identify issues. But like, it's like when my son was a little kid and I won every checker games we played, eventually turned the board over and said, we didn't play.
Yeah, right.
I ain't playing that. One time he tried to say like, I could jump 2 spaces. He changed the rules. I mean, those are all metaphors for how it plays out in communities.
Right.
So yeah, no, I do think engagement is like a critical issue, like because people don't have to win all the time. But if they feel like you can't win,
Never can win. Yeah.
where does that put you? So I don't brain surgery.
It takes skill, however. I don't think that I would want to walk into one of those situations. Even being a trained mediator, I think that it takes a lot of skill and experience. But
it's just interesting to me, like among my colleagues in CRS, like if we were on the ground at the public protest, and then like you have an incident, and you see the crowd stampede, or you hear a shot or whatever, there are those of us who run toward it, and there are those who run away from it.
yeah,
and that's just, I don't know how to explain that, that distinction, but I know who's who.
and CRS has both.
Well, we have both, and I think that's in every population. I learned I run toward it, and that may not always be smart. I'm probably one of the people that are gonna get killed, doing that kind of stuff. But it's really pretty reflexive that I saw that, how people react. And then, you start looking in different situations like, protests, right? Protest environments versus celebratory riots. Like sometimes you have riots because there's a championship.
Oh,
like
okay.
Okay, so you have like in a celebratory crowd, if something happens, you go bang, they run away from it. In a protest crowd, they run toward it.
Right. I never understood celebratory protests. I don't know.
It's not protest, but it's
it's just mob behavior.
Yeah, and they'll set fire to beds and do all that.
Yeah. Tear down the goalposts.
It's called alcohol and testosterone.
Oh yeah, it's probably so.
It's a dangerous mix.
I'd agree with you there. I'm looking at our questions to see if we can get through most of them before our time runs out.
Okay.
I should check with you though, since we got a late start. We're running later than we were planning. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I'm good till 2:30. I've got DCP again. This is
okay. Oh, 2 in one day.
It's just one. Yeah, this is an unusual day.
All right. So let's see here. We talked about administrative changes. Question about case decisions. Who decides what cases you take? Is it the regional director or the conciliators or the boss in Washington? Who's making the decision about what cases get taken and which don't?
I think that's inconsistent in the agency. Like, and it's going to vary. There's variables. Like, while I was there, like I had my conciliators in Region 9 were the A team. I mean, like, you know, I mean, they were better than me. I trusted them completely. And I have this view that every person would handle a case a little differently, that's necessary. And so if they spotted the case that they wanted, you know, almost 100% of the time, you know, it's their case. Technically, it was the regional director's call. You know, and there's a few rare times where I would change it, but generally I would do that. Now we've had situations where we had Washington jump in and say, no, you know, we want that case nationally, and generally I would resist that because they're too far away from it. I mean, the reason why they want a case is political.
Right.
And I would want to like, I understand we have to go into a mode where we need to kind of really keep you informed on what's going on. But, you know, one, you can't do a case from that distance. And two, you know, you just don't know the nuances and the relationships and all that. But they have the authority to do that. So on occasions, you know, they would do it. Most, you know, they didn't do it in my region. But in other regions, it happened. They take it over, and
Were these real high-profile cases, like Ferguson or?
Yeah, Ferguson and Baltimore. You know, and in large part, it didn't turn out well.
What about Portland?
Portland, you know, was weird because they the jurisdiction on Portland was not clear because, like, you know, in the end, you know, like when it got really nasty, it was really Proud Boys and Antifa that going at each other in open space, and it was pretty much mutual combat. I mean, even
Right.
the police called it that and stayed out.
But it
So
started out, as I remember, as an attack on the federal building, which put feds in an interesting position there.
yeah, but the jurisdictional thing didn't jump out, you know, because it was in that whole wake after George Floyd.
Right.
And there was so much going on in George Floyd that, you know, like, you know, we were spread all over. So we're looking at what cases. Portland, part of that bias is that we had a conciliator that covered that area, who that was not his strong suit to do. And so I think he was intimidated by the situation. Actually, with Portland, you know, like it, because that stayed live since I left CRS. We've picked it up in the Bridges project. You know, because that one is extraordinarily violent and persistent, but it's really complicated. You know, part of the Portland situation is like the way they're structured. Like most cities, you know, like when you talk about law enforcement, we kind of have a straight line of authority. But like in Portland, this mayor has supervision over the police department. You know, no, I'm sorry. A councilman has supervision over the police department.
Oh.
And the mayor has
one particular councilman?
Yeah, because it's the structure of it is that the departments are supervised by different council members. You know, and so they've got a problem because the two electeds are competitive and non-cooperative. Yeah, so there's a lot of I'm just saying there's a lot of dynamics in Portland that are pretty unusual. I mean, most cities it's a straight line, you know, like
right.
it's the mayor or city manager. This one is weird and it's conflictual. So we're talking to Portland because, and part of it is we looked at Portland because it's persisted, but even in Portland, the amount of engagement between Proud Boys and Antifa has decreased. What we're keeping an eye on is that the same folks are running up the I-5 corridor, and you can see replications in Tacoma, Olympia, and Seattle.
Oh.
You know, and actually some replication in California. In fact,
what's their goal? What are they trying to accomplish?
What like kind of the short term would be Rahowa, racial holy war.
Oh, great.
I mean, that's part of the ideology, right? That's part of, the Turner Diaries and all that other stuff. So that's in the ideology. Interesting, the guy who's kind of the main agitator is a Korean guy, in Proud Boys, and he
Wow.
goes by the moniker of Rooftop Korean.
Wow.
So the current CRS is not literate on all this stuff. It's different. There's a time when a lot of the people who were conciliars came out of a street conciliation background, and we can talk kind of a common language and like new stuff. Like even when they had like Unite the Right To in Washington, from out here in the West Coast, we called this like that's going to be a non-event. But headquarters picked it up and they pulled in the team and they deployed, and we said, look, and they asked us for help. So look, okay, we'll do the social media monitoring for you guys, but it's a non-event. Like the groups after the first Unite the Right, they all broke up. They're not talking to each other. It's not going to come together. But they didn't have the kind of experience to be able to read that.
Why is that? Is the recruitment different, or people who are interested in applying different?
I don't know how that shift happened. I mean, like we've went to different kinds of hiring sort of trends, at different grade levels. When I came in, like it was controversial when I came in because all the RDs that came in, there was about 5 of us came in at a certain time, and we were all from the outside. And I think in general, it sort of set us back because most of the people did not have backgrounds in street conciliation, and I think we're misreading situations. Prior to that, like when the old timers, like CRS grew up in the streets,
Right.
and I think that was. I mean, it was kind of like there were things that the old timers did that you shouldn't do, But
Give me an example of one that's making you chuckle in your mind.
Well, we had one guy like there was like you had like Black Civil Rights March going down, and then it was going to intersect with a Klan group coming across the road. They were going to collide. So our guy went to the march organizer and said, my daddy's a minister. Would you mind, man, like if we stopped and I'd like to do a prayer. So a Fed should not do that. But he did that to stop the march so that Klan guys would go past and they wouldn't have the confrontation. So I said, like, you're not supposed to do that, man. But I'm glad you did. It's like, so I think, like that's one of the times when I say I'd rather be scolded afterwards.
Right.
Because as a Fed, you shouldn't do that. But
it worked.
Yeah, but it's not something that we want to train.
Right.
But I like I talked to this one guy, Bob Hughes, when he was in that original bunch that was brought on, and he said, like, I applied, and says, like, I met, and they gave me this letter that said I was appointed, and then they said, like, and Bob, you have Alabama, go. Go. And then what? He says, well, we're expecting that the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act is going to have some pushback. Help deal with that. And I'm amazed at that early bunch, man. Like I would feel like, what do I do, man? I mean, Bob was a white guy from Seattle area, you know, he kind of became agile by necessity. You know, he was a great conciliator. And then we went through the period of saying, like, you know, there's too much like Wild West stuff. We need to have a standard operating procedure. So they went in, and they said, so, you know, I think that's generally good. And even the idea of helping not standardize, but framing what our methodology is like. Because when I came in, there was not any real procedure on how we deal with protests. And so, like, I did a thing that's saying that protests have four stages. They have an assembly stage, they have a marching stage, they have a rally stage, and a disband stage. And each has different characteristics. So if our work plan addressed the characteristics of those stages, we would have, you know, a better work plan. So this developed, and that's what they still use today. You know, but those were the old marches that go from point A to point B. People don't do that anymore. You know, it's kind of, you go through social media, you show up here, and then you divide up folks, and they go off into 10 different directions, you know, and they don't tell anybody where they're going. It's a different, it's a different.
There used to be organizers, and there aren't anymore, as far as I can tell. It's all spontaneous now and organized over Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah, but they call it flat organizations, but there really are organizers. You know, it really is planned out to the extent of go different directions, and they really kind of intersect at the end. So they know what they're doing. What they've learned is, like, you know, that CNN will follow you for 5 hours, you know, and you get 5 hours of media. You know, I think it's smart from a tactical standpoint, but it's I think you have to work it differently. I mean, I think, you know, you can figure out where they're going, you can plot where they're going. You know, there's stuff, but it's like they're just people who are interested in doing things. Like, who wants to plot out a march? I mean, what would you do? You know, I mean, because I mean, my background early is as an organizer, right? So it's kind of like saying, you know, what would it's fascinating. I mean, I still keep ties with, like, you know, like there's a group of the people who work with Cesar Chavez. And we still stay in touch and share stuff. And some of the people from that, like, you know, I mean, there's folks from that group now that now teach at Harvard. Marshall Gans teaches at Harvard, right?
Wow.
You know, and I had some of my staff take his classes.
Cool.
You know, so yeah, it's a different CRS. In this time period, you know, we'll see what happens. Like, you know, after they went to standardizing things like that, then we started hit this period where we're under attack. We were once under attack because Janet Reno actually ordered us deployed for a thing that was not jurisdictional, and Congress got mad and beat us up. And then, you know, when Trump came in, we were on the Heritage Foundation hit list. So we were zeroed out on the presidential budget. So, but, you know, the Congress kept us alive. But then the leadership, you know, through retirements, because we couldn't hire much, that was all frozen. The leadership that came in were not field experienced. And I think part of the pressure was to survive and just provide the kind of service metrics. You know, that's where this service thing shows up, you know, and doing only kind of pretty restricted, regimented cases. And I think in the last 8 years, it's the culture's changed, you know, because I think Tommy Battles and I were the last of the old timers to you know, to hang on there. And, you know, I mean, clearly we're retirement age, you know. But there's some young people that I think are really extraordinarily good, but they're being stifled, I think, by all this stuff. I think they'll leave.
Huh.
You know, I hope not, but, you know, we'll see. You know, Paul Montero is the new nominee to head the agency. I mean, Paul's a good guy. I mean, I hope he can help, resuscitate it. Because I know,
So the
yeah,
current director is leaving?
there is no current director.
Oh, okay.
It's been unfilled for a long time. And,
Why?
we have an acting, or we have the deputy serving, in de facto in that kind of role.
Is it one of the appointees that Biden just hasn't gotten around to appointing yet, or why is it unfilled?
Biden was slow in appointing, I think, took a year to get a nominee. And Paul is actually a former acting director.
Okay.
Paul was a former Obama staffer, and he's a good guy, but he doesn't come out of the field. But, I don't think, that role is to play an external role largely, but our deputy is really a very nice woman, but and is earnest and is a good manager, but has no field experience. I mean, she's made efforts to learn, but there's just so much to learn.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is brain surgery.
well, it's more in its volume of the complexity of what the country is, and like the people and different communities. I mean, like when I came to CRS, I thought I understood the country, but like as you get into different cases in different parts of the country, you learn, like, I don't know this country. This place is immense, and I come back to, like, you know what? I don't know Los Angeles.
Wow.
It's, it's complex.
Yeah. I'm looking at our time and we're at 1:55. Let me see if there's anything else that we really ought to cover. Anything else that you want to say about social media that we haven't talked about? We've talked about how you use it to monitor.
Well, and I talked about the active and passive difference, and how
Right.
I think feds will be kept out of it. And I would say that, there are other people who won't be kept out of it. And for CRS, we ought to stay in touch with those folks, because we can't, we're not going to be allowed to do that ourselves. At least active social media. Passive, we should be doing that's permissible. And even like, like, I think training people to at least be able to cull out numbers, to be able to sort it out, because you can get an awful lot out of it, even a passive way.
What, if anything, can you do about the false rumors that tend to get spread on social media and fake information about what's going on?
That's difficult, because it runs through certain silos, right? I mean, like,
Right.
it's not everyone who, it tends to kind of reinforce people who already have a predisposition, and runs through those kind of circles. So it's not the kind of rumor control where you worry about it infecting just the kind of general population, because that doesn't happen. I think the kind of rumor control I'm interested in is like like in real time, like if you have an immediate incident, like the idea of having like a community command post, and I think you can accomplish that on Zoom. But
Oh,
you might notice that, like, CRS is prohibited from using Zoom.
oh, it is?
Yeah, and so I mean, there's other platforms you could use, but some of those other platforms are more unwieldy and not universal, where you can get your parties in. I mean, you have to have their phone numbers in advance. You have to, you can't set it up quickly. Zoom, I mean, you need phone numbers as well, but Zoom, you could set up,
Why is it prohibited from using Zoom, but it can use other equivalents?
it's those that regulations. I mean, I think if you push it hard enough, we probably can get a workaround. But it's essentially because we're in the Department of Justice, and there's a sensitivity to law enforcement doing that stuff, and the prohibition. And it's largely because we're in justice. If we were in a different department, we probably could do it.
Huh.
It's, and you learn that after a while. First, you think this applies to the whole of government. No, there's some things that, because justice is justice. I mean, there's pluses to being housed in justice, but there's pluses in if we were independent. Originally we were commerce.
Really? I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
yeah, because the Commerce Clause was the main thing, right? To give us entry.
Okay. But it did come out of 1964 Civil Rights Act, did it not?
Mhm.
Okay, and I thought all of that tied into justice, but
No, we're,
apparently
in fact,
not.
like our regions are commerce regions still.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that either.
Yeah, I mean, they're not that much different, but they're,
And are the regions the same as they were originally? I thought that you or somebody else had told me that regions had collapsed. And there were just a few
recent,
big regions.
yeah, now there's only three groupings. Like what I had, when I left, I had three regions. I spent most of my career with Western, what we call Western region. And then, but like as different retirements took place, I took over, the Pacific Northwest and the mountain region.
So the Western region originally was just like California.
No, it's Guam, Hawaii,
Oh yeah,
California,
forgot about those.
Arizona, and Nevada.
Okay,
And it's one of the harder regions because it's I got the same time zone spread, right? As if you had the whole continental US.
wow.
So
Plus, there's a little bit of distance between Alaska and Hawaii.
yeah. And then Alaska, and there's places like, like there's political things where you don't go to Alaska or Hawaii very often just because it becomes more suspect as a junket.
Right. That's
Like
where Zoom would be particularly useful, but
yeah. Yeah.
let me see what else we have skipped over here. Were there any interagency issues where you were told to stay in your lane and stop stepping on the toes of, oh, I don't know, FBI or civil rights arm of justice or commerce or whatever?
I don't have one with the civil rights arm, although we did coordinate. Like I was very active in Arizona during Arpaio, and so were they. And we very consciously kept a separation between us. So we did coordinate that. Like whenever I was in Arizona, I would check off with them just so that we wouldn't end up in the same space, just to not even confuse it.
Okay.
During the Trump administration, we had U.S. attorneys that would not want us in certain cases and demand that we go, leave or not go in. And this is kind of one of the examples I have. Like our leadership signed an MOU with them that we would coordinate a plan with the U.S. attorney before we entered, which would give them de facto veto.
Right.
And so I had one U.S. attorney in particular that vetoed it, our coming in there. And I do think that was, not motivated by programmatic reasons. Yeah. And I was, in fact, my resigning or retiring from CRS was tied to that. Like I was incensed that they created that MOU. Because I think that just violates our own integrity. I mean, like by statute, we're an independent agency. I think that violated it. And I asked to have a conversation about that. They said yes, and they never did. So I said, I'm not, I'm at this age already. I don't want to take it any further.
So was that the only issue that caused you to leave, or were there other ones too?
No, I think age was a large part of it.
Right. Although you're still doing the work.
Well, no, but I was 75 when I retired.
Whoa, okay.
I was way
I wouldn't
beyond.
guess you are that now.
No, I'm 78 now. So no, I mean like I mean, it just worked out. Like to me, like the definition of work and play are the same thing. They're expenditures of
Right.
energy. And I'm just really fortunate for overwhelmingly my career was just fun. It was, like it was a challenge to work in some of these case situations um, to be involved with so many of the people. Like it was really, I would have paid to work there. I mean, it was really an extraordinary experience. I mean, I'm really blessed. Um, I don't think most people get careers like that,
Right.
you know? So, I like the world isn't perfect, but it came pretty close, and so I didn't want to retire. I mean, it's even now, like I'm not sure I understood what retirement really means. I think it's a financial issue. And I have enough retirement and Social Security and all that I'm fortunate that way. It's I'm not anxious about like breakfast tomorrow, or I have no debt. So it's pretty easy. But so I could be selfish and like do things that I still think are fun.
Right.
And I mean, I like watching football on TV, but and the pandemic prevents me from traveling because that makes me scared. But as
Right.
soon as I get free, boy,
Yeah,
there's
I'm with you there.
yeah, isn't it? Don't you want to get out? I mean, I'm getting cabin fever.
Right. I'm really lucky that I live in a gorgeous place, but it would be nice to get out. This strikes me as an upbeat place to stop. I have really enjoyed talking to you and very much appreciate your willingness to share all that you've shared. I guess one more question I should ask is, in the back of your mind, are you thinking, gee, she should have asked?
That's a good question. Like that's kind of the question I ask at the end of like personnel interviews. Is there something I should have asked you? I think you could have asked me what the meaning of life is.
Okay.
Oh, I think that's the only one you missed, and I don't have an answer for that.
I actually think you did have an answer for that. Having fun and doing good work.
Yeah, it's that, and I think that like for most of us living now, in spite of all the stuff that's around, we've lived pretty blessed lives, and we've lived largely in our lives with having running water, having electricity, not being hungry. I
Right.
mean, our microwave had to go get fixed, and that was an inconvenience. So if you really sit back, like I'm just really fortunate, like, and so part of it is part of my good fortune is on the backs of people who've not been so fortunate in doing the work. And I I think I said earlier, I've learned most of what I know from parties that we worked with, who've gone through real hardships. Like, there's the group of women that, and this is a multicultural, multiracial group of women who've lost their children to violence. I learned so much from them, and just how deep an experience it is, like for those who are unfortunate to like lose a kid. I'm so glad I didn't or haven't had to go through that. I can't imagine it, but I learned from them how strong a bond that is for folks. And that, like if you ever like organize like, like for groups just for a conversation, and how you count off, if you do groups by saying, okay, people who've lost a member of the family in the last year, in this COVID environment, you got lots.
Yeah.
Watch how fast they bond. you know, so this, you know, it just says a lot to me about like sort of like that there is a human nature to us that's really powerful that we kind of gloss over and you know don't pay the attention that it should get, because if we did, I think we'd embrace it more. But I appreciate this opportunity too. You know, it's because I've been so fortunate. Thanks, Heidi.
Well, thank you very much. And once again, we really appreciate it. And I'll be letting you know about what steps are about getting this stuff posted. I'm sure it's going to be a while, but we'll share the interviews, the videos with you if you'd like. And you're talking to Bill this afternoon, so you have plenty of contacts, I'm sure, to know where this goes, but I'll keep you informed too.
Okay.
Really enjoyed it. Great.
Me too. Yeah, you take care. Stay safe.
Thank you much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.